McGee, Wyoming.
Thank you, Vincent. I appreciate it. And I guess this is the section for the Planning Analysis Competitiveness Subcommittee, or we've just been calling the Economic Subcommittee for short. What have we been doing for the last couple of months? So Randall Lisby and I were elected or appointed as the co-directors for this subcommittee, and we sure do appreciate the honor, and we like to joke amongst ourselves that we're very proud you put two Wyoming people at the head of this committee. We feel you did a very good job in your selection there. So, I think the first thing we did through this subcommittee was to figure out how we wanted to divide and conquer, and much like the valuation subcommittee, we broke into work groups, and for this committee, we broke into work groups for different resources. So we have onshore oil and gas, offshore oil and gas. There are issues specific with Alaska that they wanted to be able to address and present individually. So there's an Alaska group, coal group. There's a group to look at and recommend future studies. And then there's a non-fossil / renewables group to kind of be the catch-all for anything that might be missed in those other work groups. So with that short introduction, Mr. Luke, if there's anything else?
Not for me. Again, before they get the presentation, a big thank you to all members of the committee. They went all out. Get ready.
Sure.
No.
All right. So with that, I think first up we have the onshore oil and gas, which Kathleen Scamma's been heading up. We will pass it off to her.
Thank you. Kathleen Scamma with Western Energy Alliance. I'll be presenting what the onshore working group came up with. So we have four major recommendations. And the sense of the working group was that over the last several years, well, even in the best of times, there was more process, more regulatory burden on federal land than on non-federal land. Given that, and even more immediately, we've just spent the last 8 years getting more obstacles put on federal land. So the sense of the onshore working group was, this is not the time to contemplate raising the royalty rate above 12.5 onshore. But that rather, this is the time to first look at increasing the competitiveness and reversing that devaluation of the federal mineral estate that took place over the last several years. And what I mean by that is it is now so much more expensive to operate on federal lands that our members, and certainly many producers across the West, have largely abandoned federal lands and invested their dollars elsewhere. Obviously, there are still assets in companies' hands, but there could be much more activity on federal lands than there currently is if there was a more stable, certain, and predictable regulatory climate that would encourage producers to come back to federal lands and to actually invest and develop on them. And why do we care about that? Because that can also reverse the decline in revenue from federal lands that we've experienced with the decline in natural gas on federal lands and the lagging behind of federal lands when it comes to oil production. They simply are not keeping pace with adjacent non-federal lands or other areas of the country that are not predominated by federal lands. So the sense of the onshore working group was we can return more royalties to the federal government by clearing away some of that regulatory underbrush. Then we can, by simply increasing the royalty rate, on top of all that, additional regulatory costs would further make public lands non-competitive and further decrease revenues to the federal government. So since that is the charge of this committee generally, is to maximize royalties to the federal government, that's kind of the approach we took. And so we came up with 4 recommendations along those lines. And the first bucket involves reducing timelines for project approvals. And by project approvals, we're focusing mainly on permits to drill, rights of way, sundries, lease nominations, etc., unit agreements. These things all take much more time on federal land than non-federal land. So we have a couple of recommendations that go under that bucket. First and foremost is kind of a big long-term goal, which is to delegate primacy from the federal government to the states when it comes to that downhole work, that downhole permitting. So right now, producers have to get a permit from the state and from the federal government when they're operating on federal lands. Why not reduce that redundancy? And for states that have a strong regulatory program and wish to apply for primacy, they could be delegated that primacy, and we don't have that duplication at the federal level where it takes 257 days versus about 30 days for states. So that's obviously a big goal that would require legislation to be complete. Right now, out of the House Natural Resources Committee, the Secure American Energy Act has a primacy provision in it. We would ask that Interior work with Congress to get that passed. But short of getting legislation passed, because I know we want to focus more on things that the Secretary can do without Congress, there are some things that can be done through memorandum of understanding with various states that could delegate some of those redundant downhole work that is done on the permit, and short with still having overview by BLM. So there's probably an opportunity for the Secretary to work with states on that. A couple of other points we've made under this reducing timelines is right now we're seeing a lot of ad hoc requirements from BLM at the field office level. I think we need to get that energy dominance agenda down to the lowest level so that we stop to see those ad hoc requirements that are not based in regulation and law. And then another sub-bullet we have under this bucket is categorical exclusion, particularly the ones from the 2005 Energy Policy Act. There are categorical exclusions on the books that BLM could be using to avoid additional layers of NEPA when certain conditions are met, such as drilling from an existing well pad and drilling where there is an existing NEPA document that is less than 5 years old. So we would like to see BLM actually use the categorical exclusions that Congress passed in 2005. And then, in general, we believe that the Secretary, I know he's working on this in a larger scope, but short of all the reorganization, BLM could right now devolve more decision-making back to the field offices and the state offices. We saw all the decisions being sucked back into D.C. over the last 8 years. We'd like to see that reversed. So that's kind of a nutshell on our first major recommendation on reducing approval timeline. Randall or Colin, you want me to take questions or just march along and take questions at the end? Or comments?
Yeah, why don't we allow comments or questions if that's fair, Mr. Chairman, as you go along?
This is Van Romero from New Mexico Tech. Just a comment on your first statement. When I talk to independent producers in New Mexico, both in the Four Corners region and in the
They are avoiding federal lands for the exact reason you said. It's just too complicated. And they don't have any assurance of what the costs are going to be, so they are directing sources other places.
All right, I'll move on.
Sorry,
Please.
one more question. Just in terms of the next steps or what would be done formally by the agency, maybe this is a question for BLM too. I mean, these aren't regulatory changes; they're just practical changes, guidelines. What's the ask in terms of the next step?
Well, I think our sub-bullets are fairly detailed. Work with Congress on primacy. Short of that, consider memoranda of understanding with the state on delegating aspects of permitting. Just get a hold on extracurricular ad hoc requirements that are not based in regulation, and that's direction from Interior. That's direction from BLM and DC. Also direction from BLM and DC on categorical exclusions. Like, I don't think we have to do much else. Nothing needs to be passed. We don't need new rules. We just need them to actually use the categorical exclusions that are on the books. And then, as far as involving more decision making, I mean, that's a management issue, so it's not like there's a specific thing. It's more of just calling Interior's attention to some of these management issues. But your point is well taken that some of them are not as, do this rulemaking. It's more a matter of a management issue. Thank you.
I can follow up on that a little bit, just with Walter Crookshank. I'm not clear what's being actually voted on. Is it that language, or is it the text of the sub-bullets?
I think it's
Everybody knows what the recommendation is.
The text of the language and the sub-bullets.
My understanding from the informal discussions yesterday is voting on the major bold text in the documents as written on the slide and not affirming or objecting to one way or the other, not voting on detailed sub-bullets, which clearly are part of the story. But I guess I'm uncomfortable as someone who's not on the subcommittee affirming sub-bullets because they've not been, in my view, sufficiently vetted broadly across the
Colin and Randall, that was your sense from yesterday's discussion?
I was going to probably let James, if you wanted to jump in, but I think that is the sense. But I wanted clarification from James first, then we'll add some quick.
The recommendation is that sentence that is in bold, and my understanding is that the sub-bullets are background and suggested next steps that the department or the secretary may take if he wants to more directly, more quickly get to the heart of the matter of what you're asking in that recommendation.
This is Colin. That's my impression as well. As the bold text is the recommendation, and then the underlying text are suggestions or things along those lines for areas to look at.
Okay. Anything else?
Steve, Lester. Regarding your second bullet there, my question is two-part. One is limiting the federal taxes as well.
Well, I haven't discussed it yet, so yeah. I just did bullet number 1 first. I know there's a lot of sub-bullets under it, but...
Validation. Statement on this. It is true because I'm the one that signed off on the APDs, right-of-ways, meaning that at the nation's level, and then we move it up to DOI. But I'm looking at the dates when applications come in to the time it's on my desk. It can be as long as like 2 years, and I don't know how companies can wait that long. And I think a lot of them probably pull out before it gets to my desk because the process is too lengthy and there are too many regulations that you have to abide by and go by. But if we can shorten it, I believe that the right-of-way part, I believe the secretary can give that to Navajo Nation or tribes that would like to do the right-of-way. Because we have the capacity, we have full staff in all these different areas that can address the right-of-way. Even the APDs, I think if the secretary can grant us that authority, however way he can do that, then I think that can shorten the process. And we've already in-house shortened our process. It used to go potentially through 12 steps. Now it's just a couple of steps from the program or from the company right to my office. I can inform them back to I need to have review those things. But so our process has really been short. So the APD, the right of way, especially the right of way, and I do agree with you. Like the disturbance, sometimes we're being asked to do NEPA, to do clearances over land that's already been disturbed. People have lived there, people have drive there, people utilize those areas, and we still have to do another clearance. And then not only that, but oftentimes the clearance has already been done, but it's a year old or whatever. And so then the companies are being asked to do it again. So if the right-of-way, the APDs can be, the Secretary can authorize tribes to do that, that would really shorten the process. But I agree with you, the timelines are just way too lengthy. And we're just not competitive because companies don't want to deal with that. And I agree with them. And like I said, I'm the one that looks at the timeline from the beginning to end. But it still goes from my office right back to BIA, DOI, and I don't know how long that process takes. So, because they have to do their reviews and approval. But if it ends at my office, that will really greatly shorten the timeline. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Anyone else? All right. So I'm going to move on to the second bucket, or the second recommendation, which is limiting the federal nexus for wells without a majority federal interest, such as reducing the situation, which would reduce the situations in which the full gamut of the federal approval process is necessary. So what we mean by that is, right now, BLM has been exerting jurisdiction over wells that we believe it should not. So, if a BLM right-of-way is needed and it touches a small part of a lease, but nothing else about the well, is the well going to be on non-federal land, and it may not even have any federal minerals. BLM will say, oh, that's a major federal action, it requires NEPA, and that well, even on private land, private minerals, will get sucked into the full federal process. Or we have a situation where, and we see this a lot, got a well that is on a private surface pad. That 2-mile lateral is going to go mostly through state and private minerals, and it just might touch a small patch of federal minerals. Suddenly that whole well is sucked into the whole federal process, requiring NEPA and everything else, even though, maybe it touches 10% or a very small amount of federal minerals. We would like to see BLM work to reclassify what is now defining some things as a major federal action that requires a full NEPA process, to limit those situations, and also to work with Congress, again, on a bill that has already passed out of the House Natural Resources Committee that would limit that federal nexus, particularly in cases where that well is on private surface and the majority of the minerals are private. So that's what we're talking about with reducing the federal nexus, reducing those situations where the full federal process is kicked off. So short of legislation before Congress, again, the BLM could simply decide that certain actions do not require that full process. And I think we would need to work with BLM to see what handbooks or whatever had to be modified to actually make that change. I would like to note that the group decided yesterday to strike out bullets 3 and 4. I know we're not, as we just clarified, we're not approving all the sub-bullets. We're approving the mainline recommendation, but we want to even take out those bullets 3 and 4 because they need further work. I think it was really constructive yesterday to get all the subcommittees together, and we thought, we need to work with the Tribal Energy Subcommittee on that piece before we put any language even, so it's not officially part of the vote. So right now, we're just simply striking out bullets 3 and 4. And that's pretty much what I wanted to say on the federal nexus piece. Did that answer your question on? Yeah, please.
Not exactly, but I appreciate that. I guess would the limit envisioned by this recommendation be an absolute limit? That is, if there was less than federal interest, there would be no federal nexus, or would it be somehow graduated to different levels of federal law?
Well, the first you just described would take legislation, and so that would require that bill in Congress to be passed. And that bill basically says if it's no federal surface and less than 50% of federal minerals, then that well, would not go through the whole federal process. But short of that, BLM can not exert its authority on wells. It could redefine what it's considering a major federal action that requires NEPA. And so limit the situations like I just talked about where there's the only thing that we need from the federal government for this well is a right-of-way because we touch a few acres of federal land. That could be redefined as a minor action that does not require that well on private surface, private minerals to be treated as a federal well. So it's a situation of redefining some of those things in regulation and policy.
As a matter of process, by striking out that the subcommittee that made the recommendation, that background language and suggested path forward, then it will not appear in the report to the secretary. So that is struck out everywhere as reported out from the committee.
Mike, that's from the BLM, so I won't use Greg phrase as a broken record, but clearly this will be a regulatory process, and by such would involve public comment. So again, short of legislation, but to redefine major and minor and so forth will take a regulatory change, which would go to a public process.
Do you think, Mike, that it would always require a rulemaking? I mean, some of these situations are pretty. You could read existing BLM policy and handbooks and make the case that what is currently being defined as a major action is not. So would it in all situations require rulemaking?
Let me just say, at least the general interpretation now will take a rulemaking. If there are some areas where the subcommittee feels that we would love to see that. But generally, we believe it will take a rulemaking, and again, certainly open to our interpretation. So if the subcommittee has some information they can help us to provide to see that, we would love to see it.
Any other comments?
I have a comment now for nations. Under bullet point number 1, we talk about majority-minority ownership, and if that applies to Indian land, where let's say this situation is where let's say 2/3 allotted land, that the allotted land should really be under the Navajo Nation or Indian tribes. Right now, a lot of land it's the authority of the BIA that applies, not Navajo Nation, and that should be transferred over to, in our case, to Navajo Nation. But 2/3 allotted land on the BIA, 1/3 Navajo Nation, and so that gives us opportunity to have a say over contracts are being developed and where we can apply Navajo regulations and things like that. So if allotted land, if it's Indian land, whether it's fee simple, allotted land, trust land, restrictive fee land, if all of those could be, Navajo Nation could be authorized to handle those with companies, then that will shorten the process, and I think that will solve their first bullet point. But if it's where Navajo is the third owner, 2/3 is a lot of land under BIA or DOI, that creates issues for us, and that lengthens the process because now you're dealing with allottees. They can number 200 plus allottees. You have to run them all down, get all their signatures before you can do anything out there. And also you have to deal with Navajo Nation because it's the third Navajo Nation land. But the way it's written, if it applies to tribes, then Navajo Nation would be considered minority, and we would just get royalties based on what agreements are made. So if we can, I think that needs to be relooked at from our eyes. The other one is under bullet point number 3, talking about cultural artifacts, is that we do have cultural sacred sites. We do have homes, so forth, off our trust land. They may be a lot of land, but a lot of it's private land. And so when a drill is going to take place, then my office, we do get notified. And so our archaeological folks, our clearance people, if they want to get involved, we're given an option if you want to get involved in this, or if we don't hear from you within like 30 days, then they proceed. So as far as cultural artifacts on private land, even though it is private land, we do have, in our case, Native American or Navajo artifacts, cultural artifacts, sacred sites that existed before they became private land. And so that's just a concern in terms of saying if it's private, then where he says...
Yeah, that's why we totally struck out the third and fourth bullet, and that's what I said at the beginning when I was talking about. We realized yesterday that we needed to do more work with the tribal subcommittee, so we're totally striking 3 and 4 out.
All right, thank you.
And then we did stay away from any tribal lands or Oralachi lands when we were talking about bullet 1. I think that's something maybe the tribal subcommittee can work on, is how to apply some of these onshore recommendations. But we purposefully didn't get involved in tribal energy. So this is not the situations you described. I think those obviously need a different path with BIA and et cetera.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. All right, then moving on to recommendation 3, improving the land use planning and NEPA approvals. And this one came out of, I can't remember the numbers, but came out of the Interior Energy Burdens Report, which is how we originally had structured our working group, looking at the different energy burdens that the Interior Department had identified. And so we kind of elaborated on that particular one. So when it comes to improving the land use planning and NEPA processes, basically what we're seeing now is, we talked about general approvals like APDs, applications for permit to drill, and they may take 2 years, as President Begay has pointed out. We realize those are all really long, and the timelines are too long, but the APD is not the long pole in the tent. It's NEPA. NEPA is what's going to hold up your APD. You don't even get to the stage where you can submit for a permit until you spend 4, 5, 6. We have NEPA documents. Our members have NEPA documents that are now in year 10 and 11. So NEPA is really the long pole in the tent in many cases. So when we look at the sub-bullets for this third recommendation, I would like to point out that we might as well strike out the first one, and that's because since this was published in time for this meeting, or we had to submit it in January, Interior has come out with a leasing instruction memorandum, which already has done what bullet 1 asks for. So I don't think we need to spend any time on that one. That's great. We really appreciate Interior doing that. We would like to see, though, that NEPA gets back to a place where it's scoped to something that can be done in a reasonable page length and in a reasonable amount of time. And so we have a couple of suggestions for that. Adhering to county plans is bullet number 2. We believe county and state input should be better considered. I want to harp again on categorical exclusions. There are many situations where we should not get into the NEPA U-loop at all if BLM was actually using categorical exclusions. And then when we look at the reason that NEPA documents take so long for, it just takes so long, we can look at some of the suggestions in those sub-bullets subsequent. We're seeing NEPA become a research document instead of actually measuring the impacts that a project is going to actually have. So BLM will dream up research requirements, study air and wildlife and floodplains and all kinds of other things, and we have to look at those impacts. But it's gone beyond looking on actual impacts to looking at speculative impacts and doing huge research documents and studies on things that take years and years and years. So getting those NEPA documents scoped correctly is what some of these sub-bullets have to do with. And then we recommend also looking at strike teams. When a NEPA document is in year 9 and 10, it's time to put some resources on that and get some trained and experienced NEPA people to get those done. So that's what some of our recommendations have to do with, and then there are also some sub-bullets on the myriad land use designations that BLM has. There are such as 60 different land use designations, such as ACECs, areas of critical environmental concern, and we're seeing these overused in general, and then seeing mineral withdrawals that are in the millions of acres in some situations, and that should not be how those are used. So that's kind of what our recommendation centered around in that bucket. Would love any comments or questions.
Bureau of Indian Affairs going to follow suit here. I'm in court now. My chart says we lose. Production, they're not coming. I have to go through that in 2 years to get that permit. States can give it away in what, a day? And then inadvertent fines also handle NAPR. The president's right. We go to our Aboriginal property and go protect our loved ones that are left there. The place you get tore up, so U.S. Army doesn't care. They don't care about it. How they get around it? They get categories or something like the wind farms.
I don't know that particular situation. You know, I would love to work with the tribal subcommittee on taking some of these onshore recommendations and changing them, as you and President Begay have suggested, to accommodate tribal.
American burying beetle. Wasn't even its habitat at home, but we've moved it from Ohio Valley all the way to us. And we're getting tested on it. And you said that a NEPA document has to be 5 years old. Well, our federal trustee didn't take care of that.
I appreciate your frustration. We are definitely frustrated as well with the long timeline.
But I got to pay my attorneys.
Please.
Hi, Marissa Mitchell, Intersex Power. Had a question on the bullet regarding Secretarial Order 3310, protecting wilderness characteristics. This is a little bit more of an extreme suggestion than some of these other just review recommendations, and just wondering if there's any analysis of how many potential mineral leasing operations have been affected by that. What number of acres are we talking about? What percentage of BLM lands are we talking about, and what's the impact?
I would love to see BLM do an actual study on all their de facto wilderness that they set aside as lands with wilderness characteristics or wildlands or whatever you want to call it. And I think that's the problem with it because Congress defunded it. So I don't think it's really that radical of a suggestion when it was a secretarial order and it could be undone with the secretarial order and Congress already defunded it. And, you know, really, it's a case of BLM making up land use designations, which I think gets to the other point about, 60 some odd land use designations that are really not based in LIPMA. And that's what we're talking about getting to. But to your larger point, as we said before, these particular sub-bullets are, things that the working group has been kicking around, but are not really what the committee is going to be voting on. You're just voting on that top level recommendation. We've got, subsequent meetings where we can flesh these out and, look into the details of some of these. So that is not being voted on in particular. John.
Just would note, John Andrews with the state of Utah. In Utah, the wilderness characteristic issue is enormous, millions of acres of land, so it can have a very, very significant impact on industry, on state economic development, and so forth. So that just to respond to the question, that would be a very high priority for the state of Utah.
John Sweeney, industry member from New York. Just we heard from the states, from the tribal members, and from the industry members, the level of frustration or desire to reduce these times. And I'm just looking back at the presentation we saw on audits and how that went 3 years plus to 16 months. And that was very impressive. And I thought that might even be a template how we could work on one hand on statutes and making that less burdensome, but on the other hand, looking internally just at best practices, what can we do outside the statutes to shorten those timelines? So maybe look at it both ways.
I'll respond to that. We've looked at the BMP.
Microphone.
That's one of the other questions. Before I get to that, I got 11 cases here. We're going to have to protect and grow Indian affairs against the defense lawsuits. That's the first thing. The next question is, we tried to run our BMP through. I don't need some of the efforts that you were talking about we need to get rid of. That doesn't affect me in my reservation. And our federal trustee wouldn't accept it. So I think that we just won't have to do something. 2 years on an $8 million drilling well, they're not waiting on that. They're going to go right across the road from us. But I will add this to the record. We won't be injecting that salt water like they have.
Definitely share your frustration. We have lots of numbers that avoid federal land as well.
So certainly from the BLM, and I would say the Secretary probably welcome the recommendation to improve the land use plan approval. As you all know, last August the Secretary put out a secretarial order for the improving plan in the EIS, and that's been looking at that. So I think it's a good recommendation coming forward, not necessarily the subboards, but the overall. And I think everyone from the agency agreed. Those working inside the agency is a process that just takes too long. One of the things we certainly is the courts play a big role sometimes in these issues, and so I think we can talk about Congress, we can talk about the sector, but we need to remember there's a part where the courts have already have a lot of case law that's pushed BLM or others into here. So it really will take Congress to come in with some legislation to change some of these.
If I may, just a comment, Adam Red, Southern Youth. I commend you for taking this on. Unfortunately, you have to say welcome to tribal organization here. I mean, this is what we've been dealing with. We've been doing this for many years, and again, I hope this does lead to improvements there. When you're talking about tribal lands, it's automatically triggered federal lands. So then we have to go through all the steps and hoops. We've been doing that and trying to deal with it, trying to pare it down for years. Hopefully this will, again, open some eyes and get us looking in the right direction. Just an example we have, we actually presented to the president a few months ago that you're drilling on fee land right next door to us, right across the fence. It takes about 4 months from start to finish. You get on a tribal, federal land, it's taking anywhere from 1 to 3 years. And really, with Southern Youth, we do everything from start to finish. So that's done in a matter of a few months. Everything's completed. What we're waiting on is the signature. So we even do the NEPA compliance, everything else in really fast order. And we're ready to go. Again, ours is another step. So this is beside the federal one where we have to wait for that signature. And we're in the process of working on that. But I just want to commend you for taking this on, and hopefully it'll open eyes, and we're lumped in with the federal lands as a tribal entity.
Absolutely, I appreciate that, and we definitely share your frustration. All right, finally, we are suggesting, and we revised the language of this next recommendation yesterday, and it is correct on the slide. Revise and simplify onshore orders 3, 4, and 5 to ensure more equitable and timely implementation. So that was the change made yesterday as opposed to what was originally printed. This is the fact is that onshore orders 3, 4, and 5, I mean, we all share BLM's goal of accurately measuring oil and gas and ensuring full equitable royalty payment. However, the onshore orders focus was on very cumbersome process rather than ensuring performance standards and enabling flexibility so that technological advances can be used. Because how we're measuring tomorrow may be more accurate than today, so we don't want a rule that will lock us into old technology. So that's what some of these recommendations are about, as well as getting rid of some of the retroactivity, such as let's move forward with new commingling agreements and facilities and variances, and not just cancel all the old ones. And then we are recommending adopting the API and GPA standards because they really have the expertise in measurement technology. So that's kind of what this recommendation is getting at revising those onshore orders to simplify and keep up with technology. I don't know if Stella or anyone else wants to add more to that. Don't have to, but I keep it.
I know that industry and BLM have been working on some of the measurements, for onshore 4 and 5, and there's also been discussion on 3 on the requirements. There are some things in there that are very burdensome and costly to industry that require equipment change or age, and I think there were some regulations that were looked at or being proposed as far as, how not to be so costly to industry and maybe grandfathering some of the equipment in. Maybe that's part of the recommendation that we just want to make sure that the efforts continue and that we have resolution, we have a process that works both for industry and BLM and for the safety of all of our residents.
And I would emphasize, too, that it's not just about cost to industry, but, it's about holding things up or making us go back to the drawing board on commingling agreements and everything. Well, that also makes BLM have to go back to the drawing board, and that's taking time away from actual productive activity that returns more royalties than moving forward. So, are there any other comments on onshore orders 3, 4, and 5? That's typical because that topic usually makes the eyes glaze over. So, all right, thank you very much. I appreciate your interest and all the good comments on the onshore order recommendation or the onshore recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, and thanks to everyone on the onshore group. That's a lot of information. I'll throw out as perhaps just a general request. I think we've got 55 minutes left in this section, and we've got five more areas to touch on, and some of them will take some time as well. So just be definitive in your questions or comments, please. Next up, we got Mr. Noah to give an overview of the recommendations from the offshore group.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat Noah, again, to present the recommendations of the offshore group. A couple comments before I get in. I had the benefit of meeting across the subcommittees yesterday, and one of the consistent comments I had was, tell more of the backstory, tell more of the basis for the recommendation here. And I actually started to do that, but looked really busy on my hand scratches, and it's multiple pieces of paper. So what I've done, because this is information I think that's pertinent and should be considered by the committee, we've inserted some slides to address those so that you can see what it is we're talking about here. Not going to move to those yet. Stay on the recommendations. But we have 3 recommendations, and that's interesting. I'll have to interpret that.
That clarifies.
Wait, almost that.
Yeah. So we have three recommendations we want to discuss. The first is to set future OCS royalty rates through 2024 at 12.5% royalty rate. And this is where I'm going to spend most of my time. In a broad sense, what we're talking about here is the backdrop is, and I'm speaking mainly about Gulf of Mexico because that's where most of the activity has been. Western and central planning areas, significant amount of development, multiple lease sales, lots of investment, all of the, what I call low-hanging fruit has been captured. And what's left are going to be the things that are going to be economically or technically challenged as path forward. Deep water, just by nature of the fact they're deep water, you've got higher costs, you've got longer timelines, and significant risk. And as Michelle and some of the supporting data, the big opportunities in deep water, a lot of them are hinged upon ultra high pressure type of projects that have their own specific risk and technical challenges. So with that in mind, the basis for why you would consider moving to a 12.5% royalty rate. Now, there's an opportunity here. There's a lot of opportunity to do, and I want to talk about why there's a prize here and what goes into it. So if you can move to those. And I'm going to try to remember what it is I had at the bottom of that green text. It was important because it's green. But what I want to give some information here on the backstory. What it is, how do we come up with 12.5%? What is the basis for this? You know, at a very basic level, activities have declined significantly over time. This does not look like a dominant oil and gas regime offshore. We'd like to see that moving exact opposite way that it's doing. So from 2001, what we're measuring here, to 2017, that's essentially, you know, a 2/3 decline in the deep water starts that the industry's seen. I think my great point was that when you look at the production associated with all the activities you've had out here, the depletion rate for that is about 25% rate, which is a remarkably steep depletion curve. So even the existing production is declining at a very, very quick rate. It includes the next one. From an early, I think leasing activity is a really good early indicator as to whether or not you've got long-term interest offshore. And just from 10-year look, you look at from 2006 to 2016, you're moving essentially from 8 to 2 in that time period. Now, clearly variations between, but the overall trend is not good. It's going down as a matter of investment. So the front-end loading for offshore isn't happening. And even from and that's from a revenue standpoint. I'm sorry, I'm not talking about the leasing yet. The leasing is another slide. So from an absolute revenue standpoint, we're declining, even when you look on it just on the more recent 4-year period. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. This is the leasing one that I was the front-end load part of this. You look at the most recent sale data available and kind of capture that 2015 central sale as a high water mark, $500 million. Since then, most recent sale data from last fall, 121 for an area-wide sale, a broader sale, essentially a 70% reduction. So this is an indication that front-end load is not happening with respect to oil and gas activity. Okay. And here's some comments I wanted to capture out of relevant studies. First is the 2011 IHS Cirrus study, which was a pretty expansive compare and contrast of oil and gas regimes across the world, across the United States. I believe it was sponsored by decline, and these are things that we believe are within the control of the government to address. I'm just going to read them out. First one, wide ranges of government takes between 53% for profitable projects to 86% for marginal projects. The Deepwater GOM suggests a highly regressive fiscal system that penalizes marginal fields. GOM is an attractive investment environment. However, it's also among the most expensive, next to Alaska and other Arctic environments. GOM nominal royalty rates already higher than all offshore oil and gas jurisdictions outside the United States. And then finally, this from Wood Mackenzie, a very recent study from them. Their comment is, however, the challenge is the key to unlock the next phase of significant volumes in the Gulf of Mexico lies with ultra-high pressure exploration and development. What's especially relevant to the projects forward in Deepwater GOM are potential policy incentives specific to these ultra-high pressure developments. Without some stimulus, these volumes will struggle to compete with more attractive reservoirs elsewhere. And that came from a Wood Mackenzie study, I believe, in the last month. So, what data do we have to support 12.5%? Again, from the same IHS-CIRA study, and read it out. Despite the risk of instability, the introduction of a 12.5% royalty rate significantly improves the attractiveness of GOM fiscal system. 12.5% royalty alternative improves the competitive position of the GOM fiscal systems by placing in the middle of the select peer group. Any potential gains from higher royalty rates will likely be offset by reduced revenue from signature bonuses in the slower pace of leasing. So that any increase in the already higher royalty rate levied in the GOM would increase the risk of system instability. Again, this came from the CIRA BOM, the IHS-CIRA study that was issued in 2011. So one point I want to make with respect to that study, 2011, since then the GOM's a lot more mature and developed, and the projects that remain are harder to finance, and in particular that was a much higher price environment than we see today. Mexico was not a competitor then. So it was, and what we see now with Mexico is that they're actively developing their own OCS with higher block sizes and a different kind of a competition. So this study was, again, undertaken by the prior administration and in a different time frame, but I think it has relevant considerations. Definitely. And finally, I just wanted to show, this will be, I assume, available as part of the backup data. This is where the additional slide information came from. I think, yeah. So that's recommendation number one, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions or comments.
Thank you. That's very excellent information. I just wanted to add some more for the committee's recommendation or your consideration. When you're talking about the total federal take, and let's go back to when we started the subgroup, we talked about what should be our goals recommendation, and basically down to two. To increase the federal take not only in energy production, but also the federal take in income production as well. So an increase in both of those. When you're talking offshore, the normal federal take comes from three sources. That would be bonus. That is the bid that companies pay when they submit their bid. And that's a flat out, it's upfront, whatever it is. There's a determination whether it falls within, the market price. Sometimes it's determined it doesn't, but there's your first. So when you hear about these great big lease sales, big dollar amounts or small dollar amounts that has a reason, that's what that is. The second income is rental. From the time a company owns or purchases the lease, gets it approved, up until the time they reach commercial production, they pay a rental. Third is the royalty rate itself. about here. Now, what this does not do, this recommendation does not change the existing royalty rate. It only recommends to the Department of Interior that for the future lease sales they have, which will be in the next 5-year plan, that they consider establishing a 12.5% royalty based upon the studies of recent. The reality is the Department of Interior can do that on their own, and in reality, the Department can set 12.5 for a couple of sales and can raise it to other amounts after that or at any time. They have the ability to make those on a cell-by-cell basis. The last point I would make is I know we're all going to hear, should the committee pass this recommendation on, you're just limiting the amount of federal money and eventually state money and other money that the government gets. I would tell you that I would argue that it's not the case. As we have seen, there are fewer leases installed in Mexico right now. Fewer leases are being sold. A lot of that has to do with markets. Market changes, that may reverse. Interior has the ability to change that decision at that time. But I tell you, if you compare a lease that is 0% and a lease at 12.5%, I think the government is much happier, and the American taxpayer is going to be happier with 12.5% as opposed to 0%.
Thank you.
Daniel Russ, do we know why the previous administration did not accept the IHS-SERA recommendations?
I do not know why.
This is Walter Cruikshank. IHS-SERA provided an analysis. They did not provide a recommendation.
Okay.
John Sweeney, Industry New York. I just wanted to echo what Don said with regard to the fact that this doesn't impact pre-existing leases already, contracted the lease rate. So all the activity that's out there now will continue at the existing rate. Perhaps for me, the most worrisome thing is the decline in lease sales, which is going from 5,000 new lease sales back in 2007 to around 150 now as of 2016. So from my perspective, looking at this from a risk perspective, there's a very limited level of activity for new lease sales. The hope would be that going to a lower royalty rate would stimulate that and lead to more lease sales. Obviously, the Secretary would have the ability, if he went to the 12.5% as you were recommending, and to adjust the later date should he feel that isn't working exactly as he anticipated. So given the character of the lease sales now and the ability to change the event that is discovered to be adverse, I think it does make sense.
Thank you, appreciate that.
Maybe just because I don't understand the basis, is there anything that prevents, separate and apart from this recommendation, anything that prevents the Secretary or the appropriate agency from considering the 12.5% rate for sales given these market conditions under the current state of things?
I think there isn't anything. In fact, they've already done this with respect to shallow water. As to see if they... No, I think this is within the current authority to do anything.
If I could address that further, this is Walter Cruikshank. In terms of that on a sale-by-sale basis, there is an annual analysis involved with fiscal returns on lease, providing the decision makers to consider market factors, trends in leasing, drilling, production, what other jurisdictions are doing with their lease terms. All of that information is provided to decision makers as they decide on a sale-by-sale basis what this return is.
One follow-up too, but recognizing that the uncertainty of the market and this is prospective and not retroactive, any way to determine what the potential economic impact of setting for the 5-year period royalty rates at 12.5% for this production would be?
I'm sure there are ways to protect it. Eventually, what we're talking about here is an income.
say this a little tongue in cheek, but first we'd have to predict the oil price for the next 5 years.
Yeah. A lot of variables. Go ahead and move on to the second proposal. What we're talking about here is existing production. And the proposal is to revise, clarify, and simplify the process for granting varying royalty rates for declining or particularly costly fields. So this comes to recognize the fact that at certain life of field points, royalty rate may not be sufficient to allow that to economically continue. I don't think we're asking for anything that isn't currently possible here. And as our understanding is that there already is existing authority to make this happen. I think the disconnect is it doesn't appear to be used right now. I'm not sure because it's not well understood, well communicated. So the proposal is to address that, to make sure the rules are clear and potentially even bring this out as part of a seminar, something that can be presented to producers or companies so that they understand what is potentially available. Questions on that?
Kevin Gussie, you say potentially I get it revised. Do you have any ideas on what revisions are necessary?
No, I think that's going to be one of those where it's going to be fit for purpose for the particular situation we're talking about. Why is it that we're at a point where it's uneconomic? How best could that be addressed?
And just a comment, yes, we do have the ability to do what you're saying here. For whatever reason, it has not been utilized by the industry over the last 10, 15 years. We have seen interest as of late, and we are looking at some applications now. So,
thank you. All right, and then the last point.
I have an explanation. Sometimes this recommendation has a way of washing on shore, so to speak. The 12.5% for the coal is the word minimum is used. We like that. And then number two, we have these debates, lawsuits over like acts of God type thing, force majeure type. When we talk about declining our costly fields, is that who defines that? Who determines that? That something is costly. Maybe Alaska may be considered costly. Declining, I don't know about shale oil. Right now, believe the basin where we are is, I think, the most producing shale oil in the country. So when somebody puts the definition of declining on shale oil being extracted in the San Juan Basin, then we would have an issue with declining, with the definition. We would have to have a huge say in defining the word declining fields. So I just want to make that statement.
Understood. And thank you, President. My understanding is what we're talking about here is specifically limited to offshore.
Right, so I just want to wash out this one.
Understood. Yeah. All right, and then the last point is perhaps a move. The recommendation is to increase offshore acreage available for oil and natural gas leasing. Given that the Secretary has chosen to make this something that he's addressing currently, we support that process. Glad to see you continue.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you.
All right, so to keep things moving along, John Crowther with the last one, give an overview of that work group and their recommendations.
Hello, John Crowther from Alaska here, State of Alaska representative, and privileged to lead the Alaska work group. From the state perspective, we're thrilled we believe Alaska has a unique context, unique resource potential, but unique operating environment, unique challenges, unique relationship with the Department of Interior. So we really appreciate the focus on our issues in the context of these important broader issues. So in keeping with the purpose of the committee to have iterative recommendations, today we just have one recommendation for the group. We'll certainly be back with a lot more in future sessions, but we had one that we wanted to prioritize today. That's due to the size of the resource at stake and the changing context. Recently, when the Congress passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, they included a provision particularly related to revenue, particularly related to the 1002 area, longstanding prospect in Alaska. And so, as part of that legislation, there was a requirement for the Department of Interior to conduct an initial lease sale in that area within 4 years of passage. Because of the size of that resource, the importance to the state, but we view really the importance to in the context of this committee, the importance of that production to the federal royalty profile. We would just want to encourage the committee, or encourage the secretary through the committee, to take every effort to accelerate the leasing process and get those leases issued expeditiously. The primary driver there is the time value of money. The more quickly these leases can be issued, the more quickly exploration can proceed in this area, the more quickly the field can move into development, and the people of the United States can start to realize their return on that asset. In Alaska, we have a very seasonal-driven environment. Our operations are driven by winter activity periods, so each year can lead to another year of delay if there's a delay. And each year of efficiency can move things up a full year if it's done well. So that's really the nature of our recommendation. Encourage the secretary to expeditiously make every appropriate effort to hold that lease sale as soon as possible ahead of the statutory timeline and get to the next step. Happy to take questions or describe kind of the Alaska context more, but I know we're running short on time, so be quick here. Looks like we have our assistant secretary. Question.
Did the work group consider whether anything should be done with regard to NPRA?
We are considering those, and we will be. We had some preliminary recommendations that we discussed, and we'll be carrying those forward in future meetings. For purposes of voting by the full committee, we wanted to have this recommendation acted on now and focus on those other issues in the future. Further question or comment? No.
Maybe just to clarify, so the recommendation is just in terms of the language that's here, so we know what we're voting on. Is it just the number that's included A and B? And maybe they're incorporated into the language.
I think we may have a bolding error by the drafter of this statement, which is myself, so I apologize. It's right by number 1. That's the recommendation as I understood it, that conduct a lease sale in the 1002 area. That should be bolded, and that's the recommendation we take forward. Those 2 bullets are informative. Given that you're all wowed by the efficacy and gravity of this presentation, I'll turn it over to Colin.
Thanks, John. We'll pass it right on to Matthew Adams with industry. Will give an update on the coal worker.
Appreciate that, Colin. The coal group has spent time since October making sure that we're on the same page as far as the issues that are facing the coal industry with regards to this subcommittee. We would agree with all the comments that Kathleen made with regard to the NEPA process. We've had some presentations and conversations with experts in the field, as well as individuals with government experience working through the permitting process. And the current timeline to go from concept to shovel at full mine is in the 10 to 12 year range. That used to, not very long ago, be in the 2-year range. 20 years ago, we could go from concept to shovel in 2 years or less. We're now sitting at a decade. As coal mines continue to move
through the reserves in the Powder River Basin as an example, as the mines continue to move west, it is a sloping deposit. So the further west you go, the more overburden there is, the more expense it is, more advanced timing that we need to get to the resources to continue to fill the obligations that we have in providing electricity and providing opportunities for that resource. The expectation is that in June, we will have a recommendation related to bonus payments as well, looking at the timing of bonus payments as the permitting process is extended from 2 years to 10 years. We're investigating and looking into whether or not it makes sense that after an LBA, coal company must pay that LBA off within 5 years. So the entire lease has been paid for years in advance of a ton of coal coming out of the ground for customers. So that's what we're looking at, and we expect to have a recommendation along those lines at the June meeting. We're also open to looking at different types of systems for LBAs, whether it be sliding scale royalties with higher bonus payments, lower royalties, or vice versa. We're open to looking at different economic models that we will need as we transition into the new age of coal, where 70% of American electricity, or 50%, those days may be behind us. As we move into our new norm of coal producing 30 to 35% of U.S. electricity, it doesn't mean that the importance is diminished. It means that we need to pay more attention to the economics of the models. That's been the focus of our work group. I look forward to further updates in June. Any questions this time?
All right, moving right along. So the next one, non-fossil renewables group. And so we got established in mid-December, and we had our first and I believe only meeting in early January. We did have some presentations through the subcommittee to get a better understanding of both BLM's process for leasing renewables onshore and then BOEM's process of leasing offshore wind. So the full subcommittee has got somewhat of a basis of understanding of that. But what's kind of fun about this committee is, as I said at the opening, it's kind of a catch-all where if there's something that doesn't fit well into any of the other more defined committees, we can get that. One of the non-fossil things that I'll be interested to look at in the future here at some point is what we can do with uranium and try to increase development of the production of uranium in the United States. But to date, we have two preliminary recommendations. So these are two items that we're not asking for the RPC to vote on. But we wanted to just give a quick update, just as Matthew did, on a couple of things that we've looked at and that have been identified that we'd like to keep working on. The first one is to ask BOEM to conduct additional offshore wind lease sales and to increase the area where those sales would occur and to increase the consistency with which those leases occur. And there's, I guess, the primary reason behind that is we think there's an incredible resource in offshore wind energy, and we would like to do what we can to incentivize that industry to grow and to become a larger energy mix in the United States. At the same time, increasing revenues that would be sent to interior. From a state perspective, kind of ancillary benefit of both increasing the number of lease sales and the timing with which those occurred is, I think, with any other industry, if there's that kind of consistency and certainty and drive, you can create economies around the supply chain for this industry and communities that would host offshore wind energy development. so there's a great ancillary benefit to the communities and the states that would host this from trying to set up such a system. We weren't necessarily prepared to provide a hard and fast recommendation on what BOEM should look at in this realm. As I said, the offshore world is a bit new to me, and so there's just a bit of a learning curve to figuring out exactly what they do now, then now to what we can recommend that they look into to move forward in this direction. But that's one thing we'll look at. And then the second preliminary recommendation, this was based off of the presentation that BOEM gave on their offshore wind leasing system right now, and they discussed that there are three sources of revenue for offshore wind energy development: are bonus bids, rentals, and an operating fee. And that operating fee is comprised of 5 different factors: nameplate capacity, hours per year, capacity factor, power price, and operating fee. And while folks can look at those 5 terms and kind of reasonably expect where to find that information, or think it may be easy to compute, BOEM was actually saying that in practice it is somewhat difficult. And so they've actually started moving forward and looking at certain ways to try to perhaps make that process easier. But we had looked at it a bit, and we're hopeful that we can get the wheels turning here quick enough to maybe provide some input and some help to BOEM on things they could look at. I'm happy to say that we'll have a new addition to the renewables group, Marissa Mitchell, and I think she will quickly become the brains behind this entire work group. And so excited about that. But if anyone has any questions or recommendations, thoughts, be happy to take them. If not, we can keep moving. One more presentation, folks, and we'll get a little break. So, Emily Haig with the Studies Group.
Thank you, Colin. So to bring us home, the economics group quickly set up a study work group to look at ways to identify studies that DOI could pursue in order to build on existing information and continue to inform future recommendations as the group move forward. And so in that effort, we've identified 2 recommendations. One is the short-term effort that we kind of kept it as a very focused scope of work that we hope could be turned around really quickly by Interior to help inform meetings, this year. And then one's a longer-term effort. So the short-term effort recommendation is a study that we're basically recommending that Interior procure a study that assesses 3 regimes: the U.S. Gulf of Mexico, and then 2 emerging areas, Guyana and Mexico. Focusing on offshore, we're basically wanting the study to compare existing tax laws, royalty regimes, and then also lease block sizes. And so the idea would be that you look at the basically last 3 years worth of lease sales, kind of see what drove investment in those areas and do a comparison, see if there's any commonalities or, if there isn't any, kind of assess why. So that's the first recommendation. I don't know if we want to pause and see if there's any questions on that study. Okay, and then the next recommendation is more of a long-term effort. Patrick already mentioned this IHS Sierra study that was done in 2011, which is very comprehensive. It looked at over, I think, 30-plus regimes internationally and compared several different U.S. structures, onshore, state, federal, offshore. So the recommendation is to basically have Interior update that study to reflect current conditions. That was done basically on 2010 data.
Apparently everyone had the fried chicken for lunch. I think that those are all our updates from the Economics Subcommittee. James, pass back to you.
Thank you, guys. There's no remaining last questions. We will break for
until 3:15, and then we'll start some public comment period.
Just a quick request of the operator, if you could please, in the meantime, ask folks on the phone if they could get in line for public comments, just a few before we